They don't talk about it. They don't need to. The scariest kind of discipline isn't loud. It doesn't post quotes on Instagram. It doesn't wait to feel motivated. It wakes up before the world, looks in the mirror, and says nothing, because it already decided years ago. It's the discipline that doesn't argue with the weather, the mood, the fear, or the noise. It just. The world fears this kind of person, not because they're stronger, but because they're. This isn't about motivation. This is about moves immune to the excuses that chain everyone else, becoming a storm that doesn't wait for permission, dark, quiet heart of unshakable discipline. In this video, we will enter through Stoicism, existential truths, and psychological clarity. Not everyone will finish this, but those who do will never look at discipline the same way again. They don't talk about it. They don't need to. The scariest kind of discipline isn't loud. It doesn't post quotes on Instagram. It doesn't wait to feel motivated. It wakes up before the world, looks in the mirror, and says nothing, because it already decided years ago. It's the discipline that doesn't argue with the weather, the mood, the fear, or the noise. It just moves. The world fears this kind of person, not because they're stronger, but because they're immune to the excuses that chain everyone else. This isn't about motivation. This is about becoming a storm that doesn't wait for permission. We live in the age of the motivation myth. Scroll through any social media feed and you'll see it. The endless parade of motivational quotes, transformation photos, and promises that if you just find the right feeling, the right spark, the right moment of inspiration, then you'll finally become the person you've always wanted to be. We've been sold the lie that discipline requires enthusiasm, that change demands excitement, that progress needs passion. But here's what they don't tell you. Motivation is a drug, and like all drugs, it wears off. The ancient Stoics understood something that our modern world has forgotten. They knew that waiting for the right feeling to take action is like waiting for the weather to be perfect before you leave the house. You'll die inside, surrounded by plans you never executed, dreams you never pursued, and a life you never lived, all because you were waiting for permission from your emotions. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations while leading an empire and fighting wars, never once mentioned waiting to feel motivated. Instead, he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." Realize this, and you will find strength. Notice what's missing from that statement. No mention of excitement, no promise of inspiration. Just the cold, hard reality that strength comes from understanding what you control and what you don't. The modern brain, hijacked by dopamine loops and instant gratification, has convinced us that we need to feel good before we can do good. We need to be in the mood to exercise. We need to feel inspired to create. We need to be motivated to change. This is backwards thinking, and it's destroying us. Psychology shows us that the dopamine system, our brain's reward circuitry, is designed to make us seek pleasure and avoid pain. When we wait for motivation, we're essentially waiting for our brain to reward us before we've done anything. We're asking for the prize before we've run the race. This creates what researchers call the motivation trap, the endless cycle of waiting for the right feeling that never comes, or if it does, never lasts. Real discipline operates on a different frequency entirely. It doesn't negotiate with feelings. It doesn't wait for permission from the emotional mind. It simply acts according to predetermined principles, regardless of internal weather patterns. This is what makes it terrifying to observe and even more terrifying to embody. When you watch someone operating from this level of discipline, there's something unsettling about it. They don't seem human in the way we've come to understand human behavior. They don't have bad days where they skip their routines. They don't make excuses based on how they feel. They don't need pep talks or motivational videos or accountability partners. They've transcended the normal human experience of being at the mercy of their moods. The Stoics called this living according to nature, not the nature of trees and animals, but human nature at its highest expression. For humans, our nature is to be rational, to make decisions based on virtue and wisdom rather than impulse and emotion. When we live according to this nature, we become what Seneca called the sage, someone who is unshakable because they've aligned their actions with their principles rather than their feelings. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't about suppressing emotions or becoming a robot. It's about understanding the proper relationship between feeling and action. Emotions provide information, but they don't provide direction. They tell us about our current state, but they don't determine our next move. That's the domain of reason, of choice, of will. Think about the last time you felt genuinely motivated. Remember that rush of energy, that clarity of purpose, that sense that you could conquer the world. Now think about what happened 3 days later. Where did that feeling go? It evaporated, as all feelings do, leaving you back where you started, waiting for the next hit of inspiration. This is the motivation cycle that keeps most people trapped in mediocrity. They experience peaks of enthusiasm followed by valleys of apathy, and they mistake this emotional roller coaster for the natural rhythm of progress. They don't realize they're addicted to the high of motivation, always chasing the next fix, never building the infrastructure of discipline that would free them from this cycle entirely. The person operating from true discipline has broken free from this trap. They've learned something profound. Action creates motivation, not the other way around. When you act consistently according to your principles, regardless of how you feel, you begin to generate a different kind of energy. Not the manic enthusiasm of motivation, but the steady power of momentum. This momentum becomes self-sustaining. Each action taken without the need for external motivation strengthens your capacity to take the next action. Each choice made from principle rather than feeling deepens your trust in your own ability to choose. Each day, lived according to your values, regardless of your mood, builds what the Stoics called inner citadel, a fortress of self-reliance that no external circumstance can breach. This is why this level of discipline appears so frightening to those still trapped in the motivation cycle. It represents a fundamental rejection of the belief system that says we must feel good to do good. It demonstrates a way of being human that most people have never considered possible. A way of living that is immune to the emotional turbulence that derails so many lives. The question that emerges from this understanding is not, how do I get motivated? But rather, how do I build a life that doesn't require motivation? This is the question that leads us into the heart of Stoic discipline, into a way of being that transcends the need for external permission to live according to our deepest values and highest aspirations. There's a particular stillness that settles over someone who has learned to be indifferent to outcomes. Not the indifference of apathy or resignation, but something far more powerful, the indifference of complete focus. They move through chaos with the same steady rhythm they maintain in calm. They receive praise and criticism with the same measured response. They face success and failure with identical composure. This isn't numbness. It's the most sophisticated form of emotional intelligence imaginable. This is what the Stoics called ataraxia, imperturbability. And it's built on one of the most revolutionary concepts in human psychology, the systematic training of your mind to distinguish between what is within your control and what is not, then pouring all your energy into the former while becoming genuinely indifferent to the latter. Most people live their lives backwards. They invest enormous emotional energy in things they cannot control. Other people's opinions, market fluctuations, traffic patterns, weather conditions, political outcomes, while neglecting the things they can control absolutely: their thoughts, their actions, their responses, their character. This backwards investment creates a life of constant anxiety, frustration, and disappointment. The disciplined person has inverted this pattern entirely. They've conducted what might be called an audit of control, a systematic examination of every aspect of their experience to determine which elements fall under their dominion and which do not. What they discover is both liberating and terrifying. They control far less than they thought, but they control far more than they realized. You cannot control whether your business succeeds or fails. You can control whether you show up every day and do the work with excellence. You cannot control whether people like you or respect you. You can control whether you act in ways that are worthy of respect. You cannot control whether you get sick or injured. You can control how you treat your body and how you respond to illness or injury when it comes. You cannot control how long you live. You can control how fully you live while you're here. This distinction creates what we might call the architecture of indifference, a mental framework that systematically redirects all emotional investment away from externals and toward internals. But this redirection requires something most people find almost impossible: the willingness to stop trying to control things that feel like they should be controllable. Consider the entrepreneur who spends sleepless nights worrying about whether their product will succeed in the marketplace. Traditional thinking says this worry demonstrates how much they care about their business. Stoic thinking reveals it as a fundamental misallocation of mental resources. The marketplace is not under their control. Consumer preferences, economic conditions, competitive landscapes, these are external factors that will operate according to their own logic, regardless of how much worry is directed toward them. But the quality of the product, the excellence of the execution, the integrity of the business practices, the wisdom of the strategic decisions, these are within the entrepreneur's control. The disciplined entrepreneur becomes indifferent to market success while becoming obsessed with operational excellence. This isn't a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for the kind of deep focus that dramatically increases the probability of success while eliminating the anxiety that destroys so many businesses from the inside. This principle applies across every domain of human experience. The athlete becomes indifferent to winning while becoming obsessed with perfect preparation. The artist becomes indifferent to recognition while becoming obsessed with the quality of their craft. The parent becomes indifferent to their children's choices while becoming obsessed with the quality of their guidance and example. This architecture of indifference is not built overnight. It requires systematic practice, like physical training. You must repeatedly catch yourself investing emotional energy in externals and consciously redirect that energy toward internals. Over time, this redirection becomes automatic, creating what might be called emotional efficiency, the ability to generate maximum psychological power by eliminating all energy leaks. The psychological research supports this ancient wisdom. Studies in what researchers call cognitive reappraisal show that people who can systematically reframe their relationship to outcomes experience significantly lower levels of anxiety and depression while achieving higher levels of performance. They've learned to separate effort from outcome, process from result, action from consequence. But here's where this gets profound. When you become genuinely indifferent to outcomes, you often achieve better outcomes. When you stop trying to control externals, you gain more influence over them. When you let go of attachment to results, you paradoxically improve your results. This isn't mystical thinking, it's psychological reality. The person who needs other people to approve of them sends out desperate energy that repels the very approval they seek. The person who is indifferent to approval while committed to excellence naturally attracts respect. The person who needs their business to succeed often makes decisions from fear and desperation that undermine their success. The person who is indifferent to success while committed to excellence makes decisions from clarity and wisdom that enhance their probability of success. This is the paradox of Stoic discipline. By caring less about what you can't control, you become more effective at influencing it. By becoming indifferent to outcomes, you create better outcomes. By letting go of attachment to externals, you gain more mastery over your external circumstances. But this indifference is not passive. It's not the indifference of someone who has given up. It's the indifference of someone who has redirected all their caring toward the things that actually matter, the things within their control. This creates an intensity of focus that is almost supernatural. All the energy that most people scatter across 100 different external concerns gets concentrated into the laser-like pursuit of internal excellence. Watch someone operating from this level of discipline, and you'll see something remarkable. They seem to care more about everything while being attached to nothing. They bring complete attention to whatever they're doing while remaining completely unattached to the results of their actions. They're simultaneously the most engaged and the most detached person in any room. This is the architecture of indifference, a systematic restructuring of your emotional investment pattern that creates unshakable composure, laser-like focus, and paradoxical effectiveness. It's not about caring less. It's about caring more precisely, more strategically, more powerfully. The terrifying beauty of this architecture is that once it's built, it becomes self-reinforcing. Each experience of remaining calm in chaos strengthens your capacity for calm. Each moment of staying focused on internals while externals fluctuate deepens your understanding of what's truly under your control. Each day lived from this framework builds what Marcus Aurelius called the fortress of the self, an inner sanctuary that no external circumstance can touch. Every morning you wake up to the same fundamental reality. You will make approximately 35,000 decisions today. Most of them will feel automatic, unconscious, barely registered by your awareness. What to eat, what to wear, which route to take, what to say, how to respond. But hidden within this cascade of choices is a profound truth that most people never recognize. Each decision is an act of creation, and collectively, these decisions are creating the architecture of your character and the trajectory of your life. The person who has developed true discipline understands something that separates them from the rest of humanity. They see choice where others see circumstance. They recognize agency where others see inevitability. They feel the weight of their decisions in a way that makes each moment heavy with possibility and responsibility. This weight is what makes undisciplined people uncomfortable around highly disciplined ones. The disciplined person's very presence is a reminder that we are choosing our lives moment by moment, that our circumstances are not happening to us, but are the accumulated result of thousands of small decisions we've made. This is a terrifying realization for someone who has spent years avoiding responsibility for their outcomes. Consider the simple decision of when to wake up. For most people, this feels like a negotiation with fatigue, comfort, and convenience. They hit the snooze button because they feel tired. They sleep in because the bed is warm. They adjust their wake-up time based on how they feel or what they have planned. The decision appears to be made by their circumstances. But the disciplined person sees this differently. They understand that the decision of when to wake up is actually a decision about who they want to be. Early rising isn't about the time on the clock. It's about taking immediate control of the day before the day takes control of them. It's about proving to themselves in the very first moment of consciousness that they are capable of acting according to their principles rather than their feelings. This is why the disciplined person's alarm clock is not a suggestion, but a command. When it sounds, they don't debate or negotiate or consider alternatives. They simply act, not because they want to, but because they've already decided. The choice was made the night before, or weeks before, or years before, when they committed to becoming the kind of person who keeps their word to themselves. This understanding of choice extends to every aspect of their existence. What to eat becomes a choice about what kind of body they want to inhabit. How to speak becomes a choice about what kind of character they want to build. How to respond to difficulty becomes a choice about what kind of person they want to be when tested. Every moment contains within it the opportunity to either reinforce their ideal self or betray it. The Stoics understood this with mathematical precision. Epictetus taught that we are not disturbed by events, but by our judgments about events. This isn't just philosophical speculation, it's a practical recognition that between every stimulus and every response lies a moment of choice, and in that moment we determine not just our action, but our character. Most people experience this moment of choice as so brief that it feels non-existent. Something happens, they react, and they assume their reaction was inevitable given the circumstances. They were cut off in traffic, so of course they got angry. They were criticized, so naturally they felt defensive. They were disappointed, so obviously they felt sad. The connection between stimulus and response feels direct and unavoidable. But the disciplined person has learned to expand this moment of choice. Through practice, they've developed what might be called response flexibility, the ability to pause between stimulus and response and consciously choose their reaction. They've discovered that this pause, however brief, contains infinite possibility. In that space, they can choose courage over fear, wisdom over impulse, principle over emotion. This expansion of choice awareness creates what researchers call metacognition, thinking about thinking. The disciplined person becomes aware of their own mental processes in real time. They notice when their mind generates an automatic response and recognize that this automatic response is not them. It's just their conditioning. And because it's conditioning, it can be changed. This is where the weight of choice becomes almost unbearable for some people. Once you realize that your responses are chosen rather than inevitable, you become responsible for all of them. You can no longer blame your anger on the person who provoked you. You can no longer excuse your laziness by pointing to your circumstances. You can no longer justify your fear by referencing the magnitude of the challenge. Every response becomes a choice. and every choice becomes a statement about who you are. The psychological research confirms what the Stoics understood intuitively. People who develop a strong internal locus of control, the belief that their outcomes are primarily determined by their own actions rather than external circumstances, achieve higher levels of success, satisfaction, and mental health. They've learned to see choice where others see fate. But this gift comes with a price. When you truly understand that you are choosing your life with every decision, you lose the comfortable illusion that your circumstances are someone else's responsibility. You can no longer be a victim of your own life. Every moment of unhappiness becomes a moment where you're choosing unhappiness. Every instance of mediocrity becomes an instance where you're choosing mediocrity. Every experience of chaos becomes an experience where you're choosing chaos. This realization is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means you have far more power over your life than you ever imagined. Terrifying because it means you have far more responsibility for your life than you ever wanted. The disciplined person has made peace with this weight. They've accepted full responsibility for their responses, their choices, their character, and their outcomes. This acceptance doesn't make them perfect, but it makes them powerful. When you own your choices completely, you can change them completely. When you take full responsibility for your responses, you can develop complete response flexibility. This is why the highly disciplined person moves through life with such certainty and composure. They're not trying to control outcomes, but they are controlling the one thing that determines all outcomes: their own choices. In every moment, they're consciously creating themselves through the accumulation of conscious decisions. The weight of choice, fully felt and completely accepted, becomes the foundation of unshakable character. Each decision made from principle rather than impulse strengthens the capacity for the next principled decision. Each choice to act according to values rather than feelings deepens the integration of those values into identity. Each moment of conscious response choosing builds what Viktor Frankl called the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given circumstances. This is the terrifying beauty of human agency. We are condemned to be free, as Sartre put it. But in that condemnation lies our greatest opportunity. Every moment offers the chance to choose who we want to be, and the disciplined person never lets that opportunity pass unnoticed. Comfort is the great assassin of human potential. It kills quietly, without violence, without obvious trauma. It simply whispers that where you are is good enough, that what you have is sufficient, that who you are is acceptable. It lulls you into a soft sleep where dreams become substitutes for action and potential remains forever theoretical. The most dangerous thing about comfort is that it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like success. The person who has developed true discipline has declared war on this assassin, not because they hate pleasure or enjoyment, but because they understand that comfort and growth cannot coexist. They've recognized that every moment spent in the comfort zone is a moment stolen from their future self. They've learned to view comfort not as a reward to be pursued, but as a warning sign to be heeded. This relationship with comfort is perhaps the most alien aspect of the disciplined person's psychology. While others seek the path of least resistance, they seek the path of most growth. While others avoid discomfort, they pursue it strategically. While others see hardship as something to be minimized, they see it as the only reliable catalyst for becoming more than they currently are. The ancient Stoics understood this principle with crystalline clarity. Seneca deliberately practiced poverty, sleeping on floors and eating simple foods, not because he couldn't afford luxury, but because he wanted to prove to himself that he could be happy without it. Marcus Aurelius, despite being the most powerful man in the world, chose to spend years on military campaigns rather than in the comfort of palace life, because he understood that character is forged in difficulty, not comfort. This isn't masochism or self-punishment, it's strategic discomfort. The deliberate choice to place yourself in challenging situations because challenge is the only reliable method for expanding your capacity. When you consistently choose the harder path, you develop what researchers call stress inoculation. Your ability to handle difficulty increases because you've trained yourself to operate effectively under adverse conditions. Consider the simple act of taking a cold shower. On the surface, this appears to be pointless suffering. Why would anyone choose discomfort when comfort is readily available? But the disciplined person sees something different. They see an opportunity to practice choosing principles over preferences. They see a chance to strengthen their resistance to the tyranny of immediate feeling. They see a moment to prove to themselves that they can do what they've decided to do regardless of what they want to do. The cold water becomes a laboratory for developing willpower. Every second spent under that stream is a second spent practicing the fundamental skill of all discipline, the ability to act according to decision rather than desire. The discomfort is not the point. The choice to remain despite the discomfort is the point. This principle scales to every area of life. The entrepreneur who chooses to reinvest profits rather than spend them on luxury is practicing the same fundamental skill. The artist who chooses to create daily rather than only when inspired is practicing the same fundamental skill. The athlete who chooses to train when tired rather than rest is practicing the same fundamental skill. The skill being practiced is what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience difficult emotions or sensations without immediately acting to eliminate them. Most people have very low distress tolerance. The moment they feel uncomfortable, they immediately seek relief. They eat when they're bored, shop when they're sad, distract themselves when they're anxious, quit when they're frustrated. The disciplined person has developed extremely high distress tolerance. They can experience discomfort without needing to escape it. They can feel afraid without letting fear determine their actions. They can be tired without letting fatigue dictate their choices. They can be discouraged without letting discouragement derail their commitments. This capacity for sitting with discomfort creates extraordinary freedom. When you're not at the mercy of your immediate feelings, you can make decisions based on your long-term values. When you're not constantly seeking relief from difficulty, you can stay in difficult situations long enough to transform them. When you're not running from challenge, you can use challenge as a tool for growth. But here's where this gets psychologically sophisticated. The disciplined person doesn't just tolerate discomfort. They've learned to find a different kind of satisfaction within it. They've discovered what researchers call eudaimonic well-being, satisfaction that comes not from pleasure, but from meaning, growth, and the exercise of virtue. There's a profound pleasure in proving to yourself that you can do hard things. There's deep satisfaction in watching yourself perform when you don't want to perform. There's genuine joy in discovering that you're stronger than you thought, more capable than you believed, more resilient than you imagined. This is why the highly disciplined person often appears almost addicted to challenge. They're not addicted to suffering, they're addicted to growth. They've learned that the discomfort of challenge is temporary, but the strength gained from overcoming challenge is permanent. They've discovered that avoiding discomfort guarantees long-term misery, while embracing discomfort creates long-term strength. The death of comfort is not the elimination of all pleasure from life. It's the strategic rejection of pleasure that weakens in favor of pleasure that strengthens. It's choosing the temporary discomfort that builds capacity over the temporary comfort that destroys it. It's understanding that real comfort, the deep security that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life brings, can only be achieved by regularly putting yourself in situations where comfort is not available. This creates what might be called anti-fragility, a term coined by Nassim Taleb to describe systems that get stronger under stress. Most people are fragile. They break when faced with difficulty. Some people are resilient. They can withstand difficulty without breaking. But the disciplined person becomes anti-fragile. They actually become stronger when challenged. This transformation from comfort-seeking to challenge-seeking represents a fundamental shift in identity. The person who needs comfort to function is perpetually vulnerable to any circumstance that threatens their comfort. The person who can function without comfort, who can even thrive in discomfort, is essentially invulnerable to external circumstances. This invulnerability is not callousness or numbness. It's flexibility and strength. It's the confidence that comes from knowing you can adapt to any situation because you've proven to yourself repeatedly that you can operate effectively regardless of how you feel or what resources are available. The death of comfort is really the birth of true confidence, not the superficial confidence that depends on favorable circumstances, but the deep confidence that comes from knowing you can create favorable outcomes regardless of circumstances. This is the confidence that terrifies others, not because it's arrogant, but because it's unshakable. Deep within every moment of difficulty lies a hidden gift, the raw material for transformation. But this gift is invisible to those who view resistance as an enemy to be defeated rather than energy to be alchemized. The disciplined person has learned the most counterintuitive truth of human development. Resistance is not the opposite of progress. It is progress in disguise. Every obstacle contains within it the precise force needed to develop the capacity that the obstacle appears to block. This is the alchemy of resistance, the systematic transformation of apparent barriers into actual breakthroughs. When most people encounter resistance, they interpret it as evidence that they're moving in the wrong direction. The business faces unexpected challenges, so they question their strategy. The workout becomes difficult, so they question their fitness goals. The creative project hits roadblocks, so they question their artistic vision. They've been conditioned to believe that the right path should feel easy, that true calling should flow without friction, that authentic purpose should unfold without opposition. This conditioning is not just wrong, it's precisely backwards. Resistance is not a bug in the system of growth. It's a feature. It's not a sign that you're off track. It's confirmation that you're exactly where growth occurs. The universe doesn't resist you to punish you. It resists you to strengthen you. The Stoics understood this principle with profound clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This wasn't philosophical poetry, it was practical psychology. He had discovered that obstacles don't just reveal character, they create character. Difficulty doesn't just test strength, it builds strength. Resistance doesn't just challenge capacity, it expands capacity. Consider the phenomenon of physical training. When you lift weights, you're not trying to move the weight for its own sake. You're using the weight's resistance to create the precise stress that forces your muscles to adapt and grow stronger. The weight is not the enemy of strength, it's the creator of strength. Without resistance, there can be no development. This same principle operates in every domain of human development. Intellectual resistance, difficult problems, complex concepts, challenging ideas, creates cognitive strength. Emotional resistance, difficult feelings, painful experiences, challenging relationships, creates emotional resilience. Spiritual resistance, doubt, meaninglessness, existential anxiety, creates spiritual depth. The disciplined person has learned to see resistance as information rather than obstruction. When they encounter difficulty, they don't ask, "How do I get rid of this?" Instead, they ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" They don't seek to eliminate the challenge, they seek to extract its value. They don't try to go around the obstacle, they go through it, knowing that the act of going through it will change them in ways that going around it never could. This shift in perspective transforms the entire experience of difficulty. Instead of feeling victimized by resistance, they feel curious about it. Instead of being weakened by challenge, they're strengthened by it. Instead of seeing problems as proof that something is wrong, they see problems as proof that something is growing. The psychological research supports this ancient wisdom. Studies in what researchers call post-traumatic growth show that people who learn to find meaning in difficulty often emerge from challenging experiences stronger, wiser, and more capable than they were before the challenge occurred. They've learned to use resistance as a catalyst for development rather than experiencing it as a barrier to progress. But this alchemy requires a specific kind of awareness. You must learn to recognize resistance as it's occurring and consciously choose to engage with it rather than avoid it. This is not about seeking unnecessary hardship or creating artificial challenges. It's about recognizing that the resistance you're already encountering contains exactly what you need to become who you're meant to become. When your business faces financial pressure, that pressure is forcing you to become more creative, more efficient, more strategic. When your relationship encounters conflict, that conflict is revealing patterns that need to be healed and skills that need to be developed. When your creative work hits a plateau, that plateau is preparing you for the next level of expression. The key is learning to stay in relationship with resistance long enough for the transformation to occur. Most people feel resistance and immediately seek relief. They quit, they distract themselves, they find easier alternatives. But relief is the opposite of growth. Comfort is the enemy of capacity. The disciplined person has learned to find a different kind of satisfaction. The satisfaction that comes from staying with difficulty until it yields its gifts. This requires developing what might be called resistance tolerance, the ability to remain functionally effective while experiencing the discomfort of being challenged. Like physical fitness, resistance tolerance improves with practice. Each time you choose to engage with difficulty rather than avoid it, you increase your capacity to handle the next level of difficulty. But here's where this becomes truly profound. As your resistance tolerance increases, the nature of resistance itself begins to change. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable. What once seemed impossible begins to seem difficult but doable. What once triggered panic begins to generate calm focus. This is not because the external challenges become easier, it's because your internal capacity becomes stronger. You develop what researchers call self-efficacy, the belief that you can handle whatever comes your way. This belief is not based on wishful thinking, it's based on evidence. You've proven to yourself repeatedly that you can transform resistance into strength. The disciplined person operating from this level of development appears almost supernatural to those still trapped in resistance avoidance. They seem to welcome challenge where others flee from it. They appear energized by difficulty where others are depleted by it. They demonstrate calm in chaos where others demonstrate panic in minor inconvenience. This is the alchemy of resistance in full operation. The systematic transformation of every challenge into increased capacity, every obstacle into enhanced capability, every difficulty into deeper strength. It's not magic, it's methodology. It's the practical application of the principle that everything you need to handle what you're facing is hidden within what you're facing. The ultimate expression of this alchemy is the development of what might be called challenge-seeking, the active pursuit of appropriate difficulty for the sake of continued growth. The disciplined person begins to view life not as something to be survived, but as something to be used for continuous development. They become artists of their own evolution, using resistance as their primary medium. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the truly disciplined person. They're not trying to create an easy life. They're trying to create a strong self. They understand that a strong self can create any kind of life, but an easy life without a strong self is actually the most difficult life of all. The storm is coming, but first you must learn to be the storm. The first movement of our journey into the heart of discipline has revealed the foundation upon which all true strength is built. The recognition that everything you've been taught about motivation, comfort, and resistance is backwards. We've dismantled the myth that you need to feel ready before you act, comfortable before you grow, or unopposed before you advance. In these 5 chapters, we've traced the architecture of a different way of being human, a way that operates from principle rather than emotion, seeks challenge rather than comfort, and alchemizes resistance rather than avoiding it. We've seen how the disciplined person has learned to see choice where others see circumstance, opportunity where others see obstacle, and strength where others see suffering. But understanding these principles intellectually is not the same as embodying them experientially. Knowing that resistance builds capacity is different from having the courage to stay with resistance when your entire nervous system is screaming for relief. Recognizing that comfort kills potential is different from having the wisdom to choose discomfort when ease is readily available. As we prepare to enter Act 2, we move from philosophical understanding to psychological confrontation. We've learned about the quiet before the storm. Now we must learn to become the storm itself, to embody these principles under pressure, to live these truths when they're inconvenient, to demonstrate this discipline when every part of you wants to quit. The foundation has been laid. The architecture has been revealed. Now comes the test of whether you can build upon this foundation when the winds of difficulty are howling and the foundations of your old self are shaking. The scariest level of discipline is not scary because it's difficult to understand. It's scary because it demands that you become a different kind of person. Someone who doesn't wait for permission from their feelings to live according to their values. Someone who has learned to find strength in struggle, purpose in pressure, and identity in action rather than outcome. We've seen the blueprint. Now we must learn to build. Every morning at 4:47 a.m., while the world sleeps in the soft embrace of unconsciousness, a silent war begins. No cameras capture it, no crowds cheer for it, no medals will be awarded for victory, and no sympathy will be offered for defeat. It's the war that rages in the space between intention and action, between who you are and who you've decided to become. It's fought in the 3 seconds between the alarm and the decision to rise. It's waged in the moment between craving and choice. It's won or lost in the pause between impulse and response. This is the war no one sees, and it's the most important battle of your life. The person operating from true discipline understands something that escapes most of humanity. Every external achievement is merely the visible evidence of countless internal victories. Every moment of apparent ease is supported by a foundation of moments where ease was rejected in favor of effort. Every display of strength is built upon thousands of moments where strength was chosen over surrender. The undisciplined person looks at the disciplined person and sees only the results. The fit body, the successful business, the creative output, the calm demeanor. They don't see the 4:47 a.m. alarm that was answered without negotiation. They don't see the moment when hunger was acknowledged but not obeyed. They don't see the instant when fear was felt but not followed. They don't see the second when comfort was available but difficulty was chosen instead. This invisible war operates on multiple fronts simultaneously. There's the war against the voice that whispers, 5 more minutes, when the alarm sounds. There's the battle against the impulse that says, just this once, when faced with temptation. There's the struggle against the feeling that insists, I don't want to, when faced with necessary action. There's the conflict with the thought that argues, maybe tomorrow, when today demands courage. Each of these battles lasts only seconds, but their cumulative effect shapes the entire trajectory of a life. The person who wins the 4:47 a.m. battle has already won the day before most people have begun fighting. The person who wins the 5 more minutes war has created momentum that carries them through every subsequent challenge. The person who defeats the just this once temptation has strengthened the muscle that will be needed for every future temptation. The psychological research reveals what the Stoics understood intuitively. Willpower operates like a muscle. Each act of self-control strengthens your capacity for future self-control. Each victory in the internal war increases your likelihood of victory in the next internal battle. Each moment where you choose principle over preference builds what researchers call ego strength, your ability to persist in pursuing long-term goals despite short-term discomfort. But here's where this gets psychologically sophisticated. The war is not between you and your impulses. The war is between 2 versions of yourself, your current self and your future self. Your current self wants immediate gratification, minimal effort, maximum comfort. Your future self needs delayed gratification, sustained effort, strategic discomfort. The disciplined person has learned to represent their future self in every present moment decision. This representation requires what psychologists call temporal perspective, the ability to feel the reality of future consequences as if they were present circumstances. When the alarm sounds at 4:47 a.m., the undisciplined person feels only the immediate discomfort of leaving the warm bed. The disciplined person feels both the immediate discomfort and the future satisfaction of starting the day with a victory. They can sense how they'll feel at 10 a.m. if they get up now versus how they'll feel if they sleep until 7 a.m. This temporal bridging transforms the nature of the war entirely. It's no longer a battle between present comfort and arbitrary rules. It becomes a choice between 2 different futures, 2 different identities, 2 different lives. The person lying in bed at 4:47 a.m. is not just choosing between sleeping and waking. They're choosing between the person who keeps their word to themselves and the person who breaks it. They're choosing between the person who controls their day and the person whose day controls them. The war intensifies at the points of greatest resistance. When you're exhausted but committed to exercise, the war rages. When you're stressed but committed to healthy eating, the battle intensifies. When you're discouraged but committed to creative work, the conflict peaks. These moments of maximum resistance are where character is forged and identity is crystallized. Most people experience these moments as suffering and seek to minimize them. The disciplined person experiences these moments as opportunity and seeks to maximize them. They understand that the intensity of the war corresponds directly to the magnitude of the transformation available. The harder the battle, the greater the victory. The stronger the resistance, the more powerful the growth. This understanding creates what might be called war addiction. Not an addiction to conflict, but an addiction to the strength that comes from winning internal conflicts. The disciplined person begins to crave the moments of maximum choice because they've learned that these moments contain maximum power. They become energized by the opportunity to prove to themselves that they can choose their values over their feelings. The war operates on a timeline that most people never recognize. Each battle lasts only seconds, but the effects last for years. The choice to exercise when you don't want to affects not just that day's fitness, but that decade's health. The decision to create when you don't feel inspired influences not just that project, but that lifetime's creative output. The selection of discipline over comfort in any moment ripples forward through time, creating consequences that compound exponentially. This is why the war is so crucial and so hidden. It doesn't announce itself with drama or fanfare. It arrives quietly in ordinary moments, disguised as minor choices. The alarm clock doesn't seem like a battlefield. The moment of temptation doesn't feel like a turning point. The instant of resistance doesn't appear to be an opportunity for transformation. But these quiet moments are where lives are won or lost. The disciplined person has developed what military strategists call situational awareness. The ability to recognize when they're in battle, even when the battle looks like everyday life. They can sense when a moment contains more significance than it appears to contain. They can feel when a choice will echo through time beyond its immediate consequences. This awareness transforms every day into a series of opportunities for victory. Every moment becomes a chance to strengthen the person they're becoming. Every choice becomes evidence for or against their identity. Every decision becomes a vote for the future they want to create. The war no one sees is the war that determines everything everyone sees. It's fought in silence and won in solitude. It's waged in moments and decided over years. It's the invisible foundation upon which all visible achievement rests. And for the person who learns to fight it with wisdom, courage, and consistency, it becomes not just a war to be won, but a way to be free. The victory in this war is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of choice. Not the elimination of resistance, but the transformation of resistance into strength. Not the end of the battle, but the beginning of mastery over the battlefield of the self. In the moments before taking action that matters, fear arrives like a familiar stranger. It whispers calculations of everything that could go wrong, paints vivid pictures of potential humiliation, and offers compelling arguments for why safety is wisdom and caution is courage. Most people experience this arrival as evidence that they're moving in the wrong direction. The disciplined person recognizes it as confirmation that they're moving in the right direction. This recognition represents one of the most profound psychological shifts possible, the transformation of fear from enemy to ally, from barrier to information, from stop sign to compass, pointing toward growth. Fear, the Stoics understood, is not what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens to you. Epictetus taught that we are not disturbed by things, but by our judgments about things. When you feel afraid, you're not experiencing the reality of danger. You're experiencing your interpretation of potential danger. And interpretations, unlike external circumstances, are completely within your control. The undisciplined person feels fear and immediately begins negotiating with it. They seek to minimize the source of fear, avoid the trigger of fear, or medicate the feeling of fear. They treat fear as accurate information about external reality rather than recognizing it as commentary from their internal protection system. This misunderstanding turns fear into a prison warden that determines where they can and cannot go. The disciplined person has learned to separate the feeling of fear from the fact of danger. They can be afraid while simultaneously recognizing that their fear may not correspond to actual risk. They can feel terror while moving forward anyway. They can experience panic while maintaining clarity about what needs to be done. They've discovered that fear is not a command to stop. It's simply information to consider. This separation requires developing what psychologists call cognitive diffusion, the ability to observe your thoughts and feelings without being controlled by them. Instead of thinking, "I am afraid," the disciplined person learns to think, "I am having the experience of fear." This subtle shift creates psychological distance that makes choice possible even in the presence of intense emotion. But here's where this gets existentially profound. The disciplined person doesn't just tolerate fear. They've learned to use it as a navigation system. Fear often points directly toward the actions that will create the most growth. The things that scare you most are usually the things that will help you most. The conversations you're most afraid to have are often the conversations that will most improve your relationships. The risks you're most afraid to take are frequently the risks that will most advance your goals. This principle operates because fear is fundamentally a growth detection system. It activates when you're approaching the edge of your current capacity, when you're about to expand beyond your current comfort zone, when you're moving toward experiences that will require you to become more than you currently are. Fear is not trying to harm you, it's trying to prepare you for the demands of growth. The existentialists understood this relationship between fear and freedom with piercing clarity. Kierkegaard wrote about the dizziness of freedom, the anxiety that emerges when you truly recognize the magnitude of your choices and the weight of your responsibility. Sartre explored existential anxiety, the discomfort that comes from recognizing that you are condemned to be free and must choose your values without external guarantee that you're choosing correctly. This existential anxiety is not a bug in the system of human consciousness. It's a feature. It's the emotional signature of authentic choice. When you're making decisions that truly matter, decisions that will shape your character and determine your destiny, fear is the appropriate response. The absence of fear in significant moments doesn't indicate courage. It indicates that the moment probably isn't as significant as you think. The disciplined person has made peace with this existential reality. They understand that meaningful action will always be accompanied by fear, because meaningful action always involves stepping into uncertainty. They've learned to interpret fear not as a sign that they should stop, but as a sign that they should pay attention. Fear becomes a signal that they're approaching something important. This reframing transforms the entire experience of fear. Instead of being debilitated by anxiety, they become energized by it. Instead of interpreting fear as weakness, they recognize it as aliveness. Instead of seeing fear as an obstacle to overcome, they see it as energy to harness. Fear becomes fuel rather than friction. The psychological research supports this transformation. Studies show that people who learn to reappraise anxiety as excitement, recognizing that the physiological symptoms are identical, perform significantly better under pressure. The body's arousal state doesn't change, but the interpretation of that arousal state completely transforms its effects on performance. The disciplined person takes this reappraisal to its logical conclusion. They learn to love their fear because they've learned to love their growth. They become excited by anxiety because they've become excited by expansion. They welcome fear because they've learned that fear is the admission price for the life they want to live. This doesn't mean they seek out danger unnecessarily or enjoy suffering for its own sake. It means they've learned to distinguish between appropriate fear and inappropriate fear, between useful anxiety and useless worry. Appropriate fear warns you about actual dangers and helps you prepare for real challenges. Inappropriate fear tries to protect you from imaginary dangers and keeps you trapped in artificial limitations. The disciplined person has developed what might be called fear discrimination, the ability to determine which fears deserve attention and which deserve dismissal. They listen carefully to fears that point toward genuine hazards and ignore completely fears that point only toward discomfort. They take seriously the fear that warns them to prepare thoroughly for an important presentation and dismiss entirely the fear that suggests they shouldn't give the presentation at all. This discrimination is developed through experience, through repeatedly feeling afraid, taking action anyway, and discovering that most fears are paper tigers that dissolve upon contact with reality. Each experience of moving through fear without being destroyed by it builds evidence that fear is survivable. Each moment of acting courageously despite feeling afraid proves that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the presence of fear. The ultimate realization in this transformation is that fear and excitement are physiologically identical. The racing heart, the heightened awareness, the increased energy. These symptoms characterize both terror and exhilaration. The only difference is the story you tell yourself about what these sensations mean. The disciplined person has learned to tell themselves a different story about fear. Not the story of danger to be avoided, but the story of aliveness to be embraced. This story transforms fear from enemy to teacher, from barrier to bridge, from stop sign to starting line. Fear becomes the emotional signature of growth, the psychological marker of courage, the internal evidence that you're living at the edge of your potential rather than in the center of your safety. When you learn to dance with fear instead of running from it, you discover that most of what you were afraid of was the fear itself. When you learn to move through anxiety instead of around it, you find that the territory beyond fear is exactly where your authentic life is waiting to begin. At 4 a.m., while the world sleeps in its soft embrace of unconsciousness, Brother Thomas rises in the darkness of his monastery cell. No alarm sounds. His body has learned to wake itself after 30 years of the same rhythm. The stone floor is cold against his bare feet as he kneels in prayer, but the cold doesn't register as discomfort anymore. It registers as reality, as the simple condition of being present in this moment, in this body, in this commitment he made decades ago to something larger than his personal comfort. For 2 hours, he prays in silence, not because he feels spiritual, but because he decided long ago that feeling spiritual was not a prerequisite for being spiritual. Some mornings, his mind is filled with divine presence. Other mornings, it's filled with grocery lists and irritation about the novice who snores. The content of his internal experience is irrelevant. The commitment to show up is everything. This is the first pattern of extreme discipline, the complete separation of action from feeling. Brother Thomas doesn't pray when he feels like praying. He prays at 4 a.m. He doesn't serve others when he feels charitable. He serves according to the schedule his community has established. He doesn't practice humility when he feels humble. He practices humility especially when he feels prideful. 3,000 miles away, at the same moment Brother Thomas begins his prayers, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos completes her 5th mile of her daily 10-mile run. She began running in darkness, and she'll finish in darkness. No one will congratulate her. No one will even know she ran unless she tells them, which she won't, because the running isn't for recognition. It's for readiness. In 3 weeks, she'll deploy to a place where her physical capacity might determine whether her squad returns home intact. The run isn't just exercise, it's a promise to the people who depend on her that she'll be ready for whatever they face together. Every step is a vote for the version of herself that her teammates need her to be. The second pattern emerges: discipline as service to something beyond the self. Sergeant Santos doesn't run for her own fitness goals or personal achievement. She runs because 19 other people are counting on her to be strong enough, fast enough, resilient enough to help them survive whatever comes. Her discipline is not self-improvement. It's duty embodied in daily action. In a cluttered studio apartment in Brooklyn, while Brother Thomas prays and Sergeant Santos runs, Maya Chen sits before a blank canvas with a cup of cold coffee and a heart full of doubt. She has been painting for 12 years, selling exactly 7 pieces, receiving more rejections than she can count. This morning, like every morning for the past 4,380 days, she will paint for 4 hours before going to her day job at the accounting firm. She doesn't paint because she feels inspired. Inspiration, she learned long ago, is a luxury she can't afford to depend on. She paints because painting is what painters do, and she decided 12 years ago that she is a painter. The decision was made once. The action is repeated daily. The external validation may never come, but the internal validation is generated fresh each morning by the simple act of showing up to do the work. The third pattern crystallizes: discipline as identity expressed through action. Maya doesn't paint to become a painter. She paints because she is a painter. The doing doesn't create the being. The being expresses itself through the doing. Her identity doesn't depend on outcome. It depends on process. These 3 figures, the monk, the soldier, the artist, represent different domains of human endeavor, but they share identical psychological architecture. They've all learned to act independent of emotional state. They've all subordinated personal preference to larger purpose. They've all discovered that identity is not what you think about yourself, but what you repeatedly do. Brother Thomas will tell you that most mornings he doesn't want to wake up at 4 a.m. Sergeant Santos will tell you that most days she doesn't want to run 10 miles. Maya will tell you that most mornings the blank canvas feels more like a judgment than an invitation. But want and do have been divorced in their psychology. Want provides input. Decision provides direction. The psychological pattern they share is what researchers call implementation intention, the pre-commitment to specific actions under specific conditions. Instead of relying on motivation to arise in the moment, they've automated their behavior through advanced decision-making. When the condition occurs, 4 a.m. arrives, the running shoes are laced, the canvas is blank. The action follows without internal negotiation. This automation eliminates what psychologists call decision fatigue, the erosion of willpower that occurs when you repeatedly have to choose whether to do what you've committed to do. By deciding once instead of deciding daily, they preserve their mental energy for the challenge of execution rather than the challenge of choice. But the automation goes deeper than mere habit formation. They've integrated their disciplined actions into their sense of self so completely that not doing them would feel like betraying their identity. Brother Thomas doesn't just have a habit of praying, he is someone who prays. Sergeant Santos doesn't just have a habit of running, she is someone who runs. Maya doesn't just have a habit of painting, she is someone who paints. This integration creates what might be called identity-based discipline. Discipline that flows from being rather than striving toward becoming. It's no longer effort, it's expression. It's no longer what they do, it's who they are. The action becomes as natural and automatic as breathing because it's connected to something deeper than preference or even commitment. It's connected to identity itself. The fourth pattern appears in their relationship to discomfort. None of them seek suffering, but all of them have made peace with it. They understand that meaningful action will sometimes be uncomfortable, and they've decided that discomfort is acceptable as long as the action aligns with their values and serves their purpose. Brother Thomas's knees ache from kneeling on stone, but the ache doesn't register as a problem to be solved. It registers as information to be noted. Sergeant Santos's lungs burn during the final miles, but the burning doesn't signal a need to stop. It signals that the training is working. Maya's eyes strain from focusing on detailed brushwork, but the strain doesn't indicate a problem. It indicates presence, attention, care. They've learned to reinterpret the language of discomfort. Where others hear complaint, they hear communication. Where others see obstacle, they see opportunity. Where others experience suffering, they experience aliveness. They haven't eliminated discomfort, they've transformed their relationship to it. The fifth and most profound pattern is their relationship to time. They understand that discipline is not a sprint toward a destination, but a way of traveling through life. Brother Thomas will wake at 4 a.m. for the rest of his life, not because he's trying to achieve some future state of enlightenment, but because 4 a.m. prayer is how he expresses his devotion today. Sergeant Santos will run 10 miles for as long as she serves, not because she's training for a specific event, but because daily readiness is how she honors her commitment to her team. Maya will paint every morning for as long as she lives, not because she's trying to become famous, but because daily creation is how she honors her identity as an artist. They've discovered what researchers call process orientation, the ability to find satisfaction in the daily practice rather than needing satisfaction from future outcomes. Their discipline is not deferred gratification, it's immediate expression of who they've chosen to be. This process orientation creates sustainability that outcome-oriented discipline lacks. When your satisfaction comes from doing rather than achieving, you can continue indefinitely because the reward is built into the activity itself. When your identity is expressed through action rather than validated through results, you can persist through any external circumstance because your sense of self is internally generated. Brother Thomas, Sergeant Santos, and Maya Chen live in different worlds, serve different purposes, and pursue different goals. But they share the same secret. They've learned to find freedom through constraint, strength through service, and identity through action. They've discovered that the ultimate expression of human potential is not the achievement of extraordinary outcomes, but the extraordinary consistency of ordinary practices aligned with chosen values. They are living proof that discipline is not limitation, but liberation, not the sacrifice of who you are for who you might become, but the daily expression of who you've decided to be. Here's what they don't tell you about the path to mastery. It's boring, mind-numbingly, soul-crushingly, spectacularly boring. Not boring in moments, boring for years. Not boring occasionally, boring systematically. The same movements repeated thousands of times. The same scales practiced until your fingers move without conscious thought. The same route run until you could navigate it in your sleep. The same routine followed until it becomes as automatic as breathing and about as exciting. This is the truth that destroys more dreams than failure ever could. Failure is dramatic. Failure gets attention. Failure creates stories worth telling. But boredom is silent. Boredom is invisible. Boredom kills quietly, one uninspiring day at a time, until the person who once burned with ambition finds themselves unable to remember why they ever thought this path was worth pursuing. The undisciplined person enters any endeavor expecting variety, novelty, constant stimulation. They imagine that the journey toward excellence will be filled with breakthrough moments, inspiring challenges, and continuous evidence of progress. They think mastery looks like a highlight reel of dramatic improvements and exciting discoveries. They're not prepared for the reality. Mastery looks like showing up to do the same thing, at the same level of intensity, for years on end, often without any visible evidence that anything is happening at all. This expectation of constant stimulation is the product of a culture addicted to novelty. We've been conditioned by social media dopamine hits, Netflix algorithms, and instant gratification to expect that meaningful activities should feel engaging moment by moment. We've lost the capacity to tolerate the long, flat stretches where nothing seems to be happening, but everything is actually being built. The disciplined person has made peace with a different reality. They understand that progress in any meaningful endeavor follows what researchers call the plateau effect. Long periods of apparent stagnation punctuated by occasional breakthrough moments. Most improvement happens invisibly, below the threshold of conscious awareness, as the brain slowly rewires itself and the body gradually adapts to new demands. This understanding transforms their relationship to monotony entirely. Where others see boring repetition, they see foundational building. Where others experience tedium, they experience dedication. Where others feel like nothing is happening, they know that everything is happening, just at the cellular, neurological, and psychological levels that can't be observed from the outside. Consider the concert pianist practicing scales for the 10,000th time. To the outside observer, this appears to be mindless repetition of simple patterns. But the pianist knows something different. Each repetition is slightly different from the last. Each practice session reveals subtleties that were invisible yesterday. Each scale becomes an opportunity to explore micro variations in timing, dynamics, and expression that only become available after thousands of previous repetitions have automated the basic mechanics. The boredom that destroys the amateur becomes the canvas upon which the master paints infinite variation. What appears to be the same scale repeated endlessly is actually a sophisticated exploration of the relationship between intention and execution, between mind and muscle, between technique and expression. The repetition doesn't eliminate creativity. It creates the foundation upon which true creativity becomes possible. This is the paradox of mastery. You must repeat the same actions thousands of times to reach the level where each action can be genuinely unique. You must automate the fundamentals to free your attention for the subtleties. You must master the boring basics to gain access to the interesting complexities. The Stoics understood this principle with profound clarity. Marcus Aurelius wrote the same thoughts about virtue, duty, and death hundreds of times in his meditations. Not because he forgot what he had written before, but because the practice of thinking these thoughts was more important than the novelty of the thoughts themselves. He was using repetition to carve these ideas into his character so deeply that they would be available to him in moments of stress, fatigue, or emotional turbulence. Repetition is the mechanism by which conscious effort becomes unconscious competence. When you practice something enough times, it moves from the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for conscious decision-making, to the basal ganglia, the brain region responsible for automatic behavior. This neurological migration frees up mental resources for higher-level thinking and allows you to perform complex actions without depleting your willpower. But here's where this gets psychologically sophisticated. The boredom itself serves a purpose. It's a filter that eliminates everyone who isn't serious about the pursuit. Anyone can maintain interest in something novel and exciting. Only someone genuinely committed to the outcome can maintain engagement with something boring and repetitive. Boredom becomes a natural selection mechanism that separates the dedicated from the merely interested. The person who can find satisfaction in boring repetition has developed what might be called process addiction. They've learned to extract meaning and satisfaction from the daily practice, rather than needing excitement from constant novelty. They've discovered that the real reward of discipline is not the achievement of goals, but the development of the capacity to pursue goals consistently, regardless of how they feel about the pursuit. This process addiction creates sustainability that excitement-based motivation lacks. Excitement is temporary, boredom is permanent. If you can only continue when you're excited, you'll stop as soon as the excitement fades. If you can continue when you're bored, you can continue indefinitely. The research in expertise development supports this understanding. Studies of world-class performers across every domain, music, sports, business, science, reveal the same pattern. Thousands of hours of what researchers call deliberate practice. Focused, repetitive work on specific skills that are just beyond current ability level. This practice is almost never described as fun or exciting by the practitioners. It's described as necessary, valuable, and ultimately satisfying, but rarely as intrinsically enjoyable moment by moment. The satisfaction comes not from the emotional experience of practicing, but from the identity experience of being someone who practices. The pianist doesn't practice scales because scale practice feels good. They practice scales because they are a pianist, and practicing scales is what pianists do. The satisfaction is identity-based rather than activity-based. This shift from activity-based to identity-based satisfaction changes everything. When your satisfaction comes from being the kind of person who does difficult things consistently, You can find satisfaction in any difficult thing you do consistently. When your reward is the strengthening of your discipline muscle rather than the pleasure of the specific activity, any activity becomes rewarding as long as it requires discipline. The crushing boredom of greatness becomes the crushing obviousness of greatness. Of course, the master pianist practices scales every day. They're a pianist. Of course, the Olympic athlete runs the same training routine. They're an athlete. Of course, the successful entrepreneur follows the same business systems. They're an entrepreneur. The boredom doesn't feel boring anymore because it's not an activity they're enduring. It's an identity they're expressing. This transformation reveals the final truth about boredom and mastery. The boredom is not incidental to greatness. It's essential to greatness. The capacity to find meaning in repetition, satisfaction in consistency, and purpose in monotony is not just a requirement for achieving excellence. It's a form of excellence itself. The person who has learned to embrace the crushing boredom of greatness has learned something profound about the nature of human satisfaction. They've discovered that the deepest fulfillment comes not from constant stimulation, but from consistent contribution, not from endless novelty, but from endless dedication, not from being entertained, but from being engaged in something larger than their need for entertainment. They've learned to find excitement in commitment itself. There comes a moment in every transformative journey where action stops being something you do and becomes something you are. It's not marked by fanfare or celebration. It doesn't announce itself with drama or ceremony. It happens quietly, almost invisibly, in the space between one decision and the next. One day you realize you're no longer someone who exercises. You're someone who is athletic. You're no longer someone who writes. You're someone who is a writer. You're no longer someone who practices discipline. You're someone who is disciplined. This is the furnace of identity, where the heat of consistent action melts down the old self and forges something entirely new. The transformation begins with behavior, but culminates in being. You start by doing what disciplined people do, and you end by becoming what disciplined people are. The external actions remain the same, but the internal experience changes completely. What once required effort now requires only expression. What once demanded willpower now demands only authenticity. What once felt like becoming now feels like being. This shift represents one of the most profound psychological transformations possible: the integration of conscious choice into unconscious identity. When this integration is complete, discipline stops being a practice and becomes a nature. It's no longer something you impose upon yourself. It's something that expresses itself through you. The process is invisible to casual observation, but seismic in its psychological effects. Friends and family often don't notice the transformation because the actions look the same. You're still waking up early, still exercising regularly, still doing the same practices you've done for months or years. But everything has changed because the source of the action has moved from external decision to internal identity. The early stages of discipline feel like swimming upstream against your natural inclinations. Every choice to act according to principle rather than preference feels like a small victory over your real self, the self that wants comfort, ease, immediate gratification. You experience yourself as someone who naturally wants one thing, but consciously chooses another. The discipline feels imposed, artificial, maintained through constant vigilance. But somewhere in the accumulated weight of thousands of small choices, something shifts. The actions you've been taking begin to feel not like constraints you've placed upon yourself, but like expressions of who you actually are. The early morning workout stops feeling like a discipline you've imposed and starts feeling like a need your body has. The daily writing practice stops feeling like a habit you've developed and starts feeling like a voice that wants to be heard. This is the moment when the furnace completes its work, when the heat of consistent action has transformed the raw material of intention into the refined substance of identity. The psychology behind this transformation involves what researchers call self-schema, the cognitive framework through which you understand who you are. Your self-schema acts as a filter that determines what feels natural and authentic versus what feels forced and artificial. When your actions align with your self-schema, they feel effortless. When they conflict with your self-schema, they require willpower. Initially, disciplined actions conflict with the self-schema of most people. If you see yourself as someone who is naturally lazy, then exercising will always feel like acting against your nature. If you identify as someone who lacks willpower, then making difficult choices will always feel like pretending to be someone you're not. The action happens despite identity rather than because of it. But when you consistently act in ways that contradict your self-schema, something remarkable happens. Your self-schema begins to change to accommodate your actions. The brain has a powerful drive for cognitive consistency, and it resolves the contradiction between "I am lazy" and "I exercise every day" by gradually updating the self-concept to match the behavior. This process is accelerated by what psychologists call self-perception theory, the tendency to infer our attitudes and identities from our actions. When you consistently act like a disciplined person, you begin to see yourself as a disciplined person. When you repeatedly make choices that require strength, you begin to identify as someone who is strong. When you consistently prioritize long-term benefit over short-term pleasure, you begin to understand yourself as someone who is wise. The transformation is not just cognitive, it's neurological. Brain imaging studies show that when people undergo significant identity shifts, the neural networks associated with self-referential thinking actually change. The brain literally rewires itself to support the new identity, making behaviors that align with that identity feel more natural and automatic. This neurological transformation explains why the disciplined person eventually stops experiencing their discipline as discipline. When the neural pathways that support disciplined behavior become as well developed as the pathways that support breathing, disciplined action feels as natural as breathing. It's no longer a conscious override of natural impulses. It's the natural expression of who you've become. The Stoics understood this transformation through their concept of virtue as a kind of knowledge. They believed that once you truly understood what was good for you, not intellectually but experientially, you would naturally choose it. The person who has experienced the satisfaction of disciplined living at a deep enough level doesn't need to force themselves to be disciplined. They want to be disciplined because they've learned that disciplined living is the only life worth living. This want is different from the superficial wanting that characterizes motivation. It's not the emotional high of inspiration or the temporary enthusiasm of resolution. It's the deep, quiet knowing that comes from having tried both disciplined and undisciplined living, and recognizing which one actually serves your deepest needs and highest aspirations. The transformation is complete when discipline becomes not something you do for your identity, but something your identity does through you. You don't wake up early because you've decided that disciplined people wake up early. You wake up early because you are someone who wakes up early. You don't choose difficult challenges because you think you should. You choose difficult challenges because you are someone who embraces challenge. This is the ultimate paradox of the furnace of identity. By consistently acting like someone you're not, you become someone you are. By repeatedly choosing to override your natural impulses, you develop new natural impulses. By forcing yourself to do what disciplined people do, you become someone for whom disciplined action is no longer force but flow. The person emerging from this furnace is qualitatively different from the person who entered it. They haven't just developed new habits, they've developed a new nature. They haven't just changed their behavior, they've changed their identity. They haven't just learned to be disciplined, they've learned to be someone for whom discipline is natural. This transformation is irreversible in a way that habit formation is not. You can break a habit, but you cannot unknow who you've become. You can stop doing something you've learned to do, but you cannot stop being someone you've learned to be. The identity forged in the furnace of consistent action becomes the foundation from which all future action flows. The scariest thing about this level of discipline is not the effort required to develop it, but the recognition that once it's developed, it fundamentally changes what it means to be human. The person who has been through this furnace has discovered that human nature is not fixed, that identity is not given, and that who you are is ultimately a choice that can be made and remade through the accumulated weight of daily decisions. They have become living proof that we are not prisoners of our personalities, but architects of our own becoming. There is a particular quality of silence that settles around someone who has learned to act regardless of external circumstances. It's not the silence of withdrawal or resignation, but the silence of complete self-possession. They don't need to explain themselves because their actions speak with a clarity that words could never achieve. They don't need to justify their choices because their results provide all the justification necessary. They don't need to convince others of their worth because they've stopped needing external validation to confirm what they already know about themselves. This silence is not empty. It's full of power that has been gathered from 1,000 moments of choosing principle over preference. Full of strength that has been accumulated through countless decisions to act according to values rather than emotions. Full of certainty that has been forged in the fire of consistent action despite inconsistent feelings. The transformation is complete when you realize that the external world has lost its power to determine your internal state. The market crashes, but your commitment to daily improvement remains unchanged. The criticism comes, but your dedication to your principles remains unshaken. The praise arrives, but your sense of self-worth remains internally generated. You have become what the Stoics called autarkic, self-sufficient in the deepest possible sense. This self-sufficiency is not isolation or arrogance. It's not the pretense that external circumstances don't matter or that other people's opinions are irrelevant. It's the recognition that while external circumstances and other people's opinions can provide valuable information, they cannot and should not determine your fundamental choices about how to live, who to be, and what to do with the time you've been given. When you reach this level of psychological autonomy, something profound shifts in how you move through the world. You stop performing for an audience that isn't paying attention. You stop seeking permission from people who have no authority over your choices. You stop waiting for conditions to be perfect before you begin living according to your deepest values and highest aspirations. The silence that emerges from this shift is the silence of someone who has nothing to prove because they've already proven everything to themselves. They've demonstrated their capacity to keep their word when keeping it was difficult. They've shown their ability to act courageously when fear was present. They've confirmed their willingness to choose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, principle over popularity. This demonstration was not for others, it was for themselves. But the effect on others is unmistakable. When you stop needing external validation, you paradoxically become more worthy of respect. When you stop performing for approval, you naturally command attention. When you stop justifying your choices become self-evidently justified. The psychological research reveals what the Stoics understood intuitively. People with high levels of autonomous motivation, the ability to act according to internal rather than external drivers, demonstrate higher levels of psychological well-being, more sustained performance, and greater resilience under stress. They've learned to generate their own sense of purpose, meaning, and direction, rather than depending on external sources to provide these essential elements of human flourishing. But this autonomy is not achieved through rejection of the external world. It's achieved through proper relationship with the external world. The disciplined person doesn't ignore outside circumstances. They simply refuse to let outside circumstances determine inside choices. They pay attention to external feedback without being controlled by external approval. They consider outside opinions without being dependent on outside validation. This creates what might be called responsive autonomy, the ability to respond to external circumstances in ways that serve internal values rather than reacting to external circumstances in ways that abandon internal principles. They can adapt their tactics while maintaining their strategy. They can adjust their methods while preserving their mission. They can change their approach while protecting their purpose. The silence that accompanies this level of autonomy contains within it a different kind of communication. When you stop talking about what you're going to do and simply do it, your actions begin to speak with unprecedented clarity. When you stop explaining why you're doing what you're doing and simply demonstrate it through consistent behavior, your commitment becomes undeniable. When you stop justifying your choices and simply live the consequences of those choices, your character becomes self-evident. This silent communication is more powerful than any words because it cannot be misunderstood or misinterpreted. Actions have a directness that language lacks. Behavior has a clarity that explanation cannot achieve. Consistency has a persuasive power that argument can never match. The person operating from this level of silence has learned something profound about the nature of personal power. Real power is not the ability to control external circumstances. It's the ability to remain internally consistent regardless of external circumstances. Real strength is not the capacity to force outcomes. It's the capacity to maintain principles when outcomes are uncertain. Real influence is not the skill of changing other people's minds. It's the discipline of living in ways that demonstrate the value of the principles you espouse. This understanding transforms their relationship to every aspect of life. They stop trying to convince others to change and start focusing on changing themselves. They stop attempting to control outcomes and start concentrating on controlling their responses to outcomes. They stop seeking to manage other people's opinions and start managing their own character. The silence becomes a form of teaching without preaching, influence without manipulation, leadership without domination. When you embody your values consistently, you give others permission to do the same. When you demonstrate that it's possible to act according to principle despite external pressure, you prove to others that such action is available to them as well. But perhaps most importantly, the silence becomes a form of self-respect that doesn't require external confirmation. You've learned to trust your own judgment, not because you're always right, but because you've developed a reliable process for making decisions that align with your deepest values. You've learned to respect your own choices, not because they always produce perfect outcomes, but because they consistently express your authentic character. This self-respect is unshakable because it's not dependent on external validation or perfect results. It's based on the more fundamental recognition that you are someone who can be trusted to act according to your principles, to keep your word to yourself, to choose growth over comfort, to prioritize long-term well-being over short-term pleasure. The silence that emerges from this recognition is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has something more important to do than talk about what they're going to do. It's the silence of someone who has moved beyond the need to explain themselves because they've learned to express themselves through the consistency of their actions and the integrity of their choices. This is the silence that becomes power. Not power over others, but power over oneself. Not the power to control external circumstances, but the power to remain internally consistent regardless of external circumstances. Not the power to force outcomes, but the power to choose responses. Not the power to change the world, but the power to ensure that whatever changes occur in the world, they will find you prepared, principled, and unshaken. In this silence, you discover that you need nothing from the external world to be complete, nothing from other people to be whole, nothing from circumstances to be content. You have become autonomous in the deepest sense, not independent of the world, but independent in the world. Not separate from life, but self-directed within life. The silence has become your power, and your power has become your silence. When you encounter someone operating from true discipline, something primal in you recognizes that you're in the presence of a different kind of human being. They don't announce this difference. They embody it. They don't claim superiority. They simply demonstrate capability. They don't seek to intimidate. They simply illuminate by their very existence the gap between who you are and who you could become. This illumination is what terrifies. The terror is not of them, but of the implications of their existence. If they can wake up at 4:30 a.m. every day for 10 years, what's your excuse for hitting snooze? If they can maintain their principles under pressure, what's your justification for abandoning yours when things get difficult? If they can build something meaningful through daily discipline, what's your reason for waiting for perfect conditions? Their presence is a walking refutation of every excuse you've ever made for not becoming who you're capable of becoming. This is why truly disciplined people often find themselves isolated, misunderstood, and sometimes resented. They represent a possibility that most people would prefer to believe doesn't exist. Their existence suggests that the limitations most people accept as inevitable are actually choices that most people make unconsciously. This suggestion is deeply threatening to someone who has built their identity around their limitations rather than their potential. The world responds to this threat in predictable ways. First comes denial. They must be naturally gifted. They probably come from privilege. They must have some secret advantage. The possibility that their discipline is available to anyone who chooses to develop it is too challenging to accept, so it must be explained away through factors beyond the observer's control. When denial fails, rationalization emerges. They're probably unhappy. They must be missing out on life. They're definitely obsessed or unbalanced. The disciplined person's contentment with delayed gratification and satisfaction with process over outcome challenges the cultural narrative that happiness comes from immediate pleasure and external validation. This challenge must be neutralized by pathologizing the very behavior that creates genuine satisfaction. When rationalization proves insufficient, rejection arrives. They're showing off. They're trying to make the rest of us look bad. They think they're better than everyone else. The disciplined person's refusal to lower their standards to match group norms is interpreted as judgment of those who maintain lower standards. Their commitment to excellence is experienced as criticism of mediocrity, even when no criticism is intended or expressed. But underneath all these responses lies a deeper recognition. The disciplined person has achieved something that everyone wants, but few are willing to earn. They've developed genuine self-respect that doesn't depend on external validation. They've created internal security that can't be shaken by external circumstances. They've built a life of meaning that doesn't require constant entertainment or stimulation to sustain itself. This achievement is terrifying because it exposes the hollowness of the alternatives. When you see someone who has learned to find satisfaction in discipline, the emptiness of seeking satisfaction in indulgence becomes obvious. When you witness someone who generates their own sense of purpose, the futility of waiting for purpose to be provided by others becomes clear. When you observe someone who creates their own stability through consistent action, the fragility of stability based on favorable circumstances becomes apparent. The Stoics understood this dynamic perfectly. Epictetus wrote about how the person who is truly free from dependence on external circumstances for their well-being, makes others uncomfortable because their freedom highlights everyone else's bondage. Marcus Aurelius noted how people often resent those who refuse to participate in the collective delusion that happiness comes from external sources. But here's what makes this particularly challenging for the disciplined person. They must learn to maintain their standards without being attached to others adopting those same standards. They must continue to choose excellence while accepting that others may choose mediocrity. They must persist in their commitment to growth while remaining unaffected by others' commitment to comfort. This requires developing what might be called compassionate detachment, the ability to care about others' well-being without needing them to make the same choices you've made for your well-being. It means recognizing that your discipline serves you without needing others to recognize that it could serve them too. It means understanding that your commitment to excellence is not a judgment of others' commitment to ease. The disciplined person learns to expect misunderstanding and remain unmoved by it. They understand that their choice to live differently will inevitably be interpreted as criticism of those who choose to live conventionally. They accept that their commitment to difficulty will be seen as rejection of those who prefer comfort. They recognize that their satisfaction with process will be viewed as judgment of those who focus solely on outcomes. This acceptance is not resignation, it's wisdom. They've learned that trying to justify their choices to people who haven't made similar choices is futile. Explanation cannot convey what only experience can teach. Words cannot communicate what only practice can reveal. Theory cannot substitute for the understanding that comes only through consistent action over extended time. So they stop trying to convince and start focusing on demonstrating. They stop seeking approval and start generating results. They stop explaining their choices and start living the consequences of those choices. They allow their life to speak for itself, knowing that those who are ready to hear will understand, and those who aren't ready won't be convinced by any amount of argument. This shift from explaining to exemplifying creates a different kind of influence. Instead of trying to change minds through persuasion, they change minds through inspiration. Instead of attempting to modify behavior through argument, they modify behavior through example. Instead of seeking to transform others through words, they transform others through the undeniable power of a life lived according to principle. But perhaps most importantly, they learn to find satisfaction in their own transformation, regardless of whether it catalyzes transformation in others. They discover that the real reward of discipline is not the external recognition it may or may not generate, but the internal recognition it definitely generates. They learn to value their own respect for themselves more than others' respect for them. This internal validation makes them genuinely dangerous to the systems and structures that depend on people's need for external validation. When you don't need approval, you can't be controlled through the promise or withdrawal of approval. When you don't need recognition, you can't be manipulated through the offer or threat of recognition. When you don't need acceptance, you can't be compromised through the possibility of rejection. The disciplined person becomes ungovernable in the deepest sense, not rebellious or antisocial, but simply immune to the forms of control that work on most people. They can be influenced through reason, moved through love, and inspired through vision, but they cannot be coerced through fear or bribed through comfort. This is what truly terrifies about this level of discipline. Not the strength of the person who possesses it, but the weakness it reveals in the systems that depend on people remaining weak. Not the power of those who develop it, but the powerlessness it exposes in those who profit from others' lack of development. The disciplined person stands as living proof that another way of being human is possible, a way that doesn't require external permission to pursue internal purposes, external validation to maintain internal confidence, or external entertainment to sustain internal satisfaction. This proof is what makes them terrifying to some and inspiring to others. To those who prefer the safety of collective limitation, they represent a dangerous possibility. To those who recognize their own potential for individual transformation, they represent a hopeful example. The discipline that terrifies the world is not the discipline of rigid control or harsh self-punishment. It's the discipline of someone who has learned to be genuinely free in a world full of people who have forgotten that freedom is possible. The most sophisticated battlefield in human existence is not fought with weapons or armies, but with neurotransmitters and neural pathways. It's the war between the limbic system, ancient, powerful, designed for immediate survival, and the prefrontal cortex, evolved, rational, designed for long-term flourishing. Every moment of emotional reactivity is a victory for the limbic system. Every moment of conscious response is a victory for the prefrontal cortex. The disciplined person has learned to win this war not by destroying the limbic system, but by making the prefrontal cortex so strong that it can overrule limbic impulses without suppressing limbic information. This is emotional mastery, not the elimination of feeling, but the conscious choice of response regardless of feeling. Most people live as prisoners of their emotional weather patterns. They feel angry, so they act angrily. They feel afraid, so they act cautiously. They feel excited, so they act impulsively. They feel sad, so they act withdrawingly. They've never learned that feeling and acting are separate processes that can be consciously disconnected from each other. They mistake emotional experience for behavioral inevitability. The disciplined person has learned to create space between emotional stimulus and behavioral response. When anger arises, they feel it fully, but choose their action based on what the situation requires, rather than what the emotion demands. When fear emerges, they acknowledge it completely, but move forward according to their values, rather than backward according to their anxiety. When excitement appears, they experience it thoroughly, but make decisions based on wisdom rather than enthusiasm. This space between feeling and action is where freedom lives. Without this space, you are a slave to whatever emotion happens to be dominant in any given moment. With this space, you become the conscious author of your responses regardless of your emotional state. You can be afraid and courageous simultaneously. You can be angry and wise at the same time. You can be sad and still take constructive action. The neurological basis for this mastery is well established. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, responds to perceived threats within milliseconds, flooding the system with stress hormones and preparing the body for fight, flight, or freeze responses. This system served our ancestors well when threats were primarily physical and immediate. But in the modern world, where threats are primarily psychological and long-term, the ancient alarm system often creates more problems than it solves. The prefrontal cortex, by contrast, is capable of complex analysis, long-term planning, and conscious choice. But it operates more slowly than the amygdala and requires more energy to function effectively. When you're tired, stressed, or overwhelmed, prefrontal function decreases and limbic reactivity increases. This is why you're more likely to lose your temper when you're exhausted or make poor decisions when you're under pressure. The disciplined person trains their prefrontal cortex like an athlete trains their muscles. Through consistent practice of conscious choice-making, they strengthen their capacity for rational response, even under emotional pressure. They develop what neuroscientists call cognitive control, the ability to direct attention, regulate emotion, and choose action according to goals rather than impulses. This training happens in thousands of small moments. Every time you feel the urge to check your phone and choose not to, you strengthen cognitive control. Every time you feel angry and choose to speak calmly anyway, you build emotional regulation capacity. Every time you feel like quitting and choose to continue, you develop persistent circuitry. Every conscious choice strengthens the neural pathways that make future conscious choices easier. But emotional mastery is not emotional suppression. The disciplined person doesn't try to eliminate emotions. They try to use emotions as information while making decisions based on values. Anger provides information about boundaries that may have been crossed. Fear provides information about risks that may need to be managed. Sadness provides information about losses that may need to be grieved. The emotion is valuable. The automatic behavioral response to the emotion may not be. This distinction requires developing what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish between different emotional states with precision. Instead of just feeling bad, you learn to distinguish between frustrated, disappointed, overwhelmed, and anxious. Instead of just feeling good, you learn to distinguish between content, excited, proud, and peaceful. This granularity allows for more sophisticated responses because different emotions require different strategies. The Stoics developed this understanding 2,000 years before modern neuroscience confirmed it. They distinguished between initial impressions, the immediate emotional and cognitive reactions that arise automatically, and judgments, the conscious evaluations that determine action. Epictetus taught that we cannot control our initial impressions, but we can control our judgments about those impressions. This distinction is liberating because it removes the pressure to control emotional reactions while emphasizing the responsibility to control behavioral responses. You don't have to feel calm to act calmly. You don't have to feel confident to act courageously. You don't have to feel motivated to act consistently. You simply have to choose your action based on your principles rather than your emotions. The practice of emotional mastery involves several key components. First is emotional awareness, the ability to recognize what you're feeling as you're feeling it. This requires developing the habit of checking in with your emotional state regularly throughout the day. Most people go hours without consciously recognizing their emotional state, making conscious response impossible. Second is emotional acceptance, the willingness to experience emotions without immediately trying to change them or escape from them. Paradoxically, accepting emotions often reduces their intensity because resistance to emotional experience often amplifies emotional experience. When you stop fighting your feelings, they often settle naturally. Third is cognitive reappraisal, the ability to consciously reframe the meaning of emotional triggers. Instead of thinking, "This traffic is ruining my day," you might think, "This traffic is giving me unexpected time to practice patience." Instead of thinking, "This criticism means I'm failing," you might think, "This criticism is providing information I can use to improve." Fourth is behavioral choice, the selection of actions based on values rather than emotions. This is where the rubber meets the road. You can be aware of your emotions, accepting of your emotions, and even skilled at reframing your emotions. But without the ability to choose behavior based on something other than emotion, emotional mastery remains theoretical. The disciplined person practicing emotional mastery appears almost supernatural to those still trapped in emotional reactivity. They seem to operate from a different emotional weather system, not because they don't experience storms, but because they've learned to navigate storms without being blown off course by them. This navigation creates stability that others find both attractive and mysterious. The emotionally masterful person becomes a port in the storm for others because they've learned to be a port in the storm for themselves. Their presence alone can be calming because their calm presence demonstrates that remaining centered during turbulence is possible. But perhaps most importantly, emotional mastery creates the internal conditions necessary for wisdom to emerge. When you're not constantly reacting to emotional impulses, mental space opens up for reflection, planning, and creative problem-solving. When you're not exhausted by emotional volatility, energy becomes available for productive action. When you're not controlled by fear, opportunities that were previously invisible become apparent. This is the ultimate prize of winning the inner war, not the absence of emotional experience, but the presence of conscious choice. Not the elimination of feeling, but the liberation from being controlled by feeling. Not emotional numbness, but emotional wisdom. The person who has achieved this level of mastery has learned to use their emotions as fuel rather than being consumed by them as fire. They've discovered that the same emotional energy that can destroy when uncontrolled can create when consciously directed. They've found that the goal is not to have different emotions, but to have a different relationship with the emotions they have. In winning this war, they don't defeat their humanity, they fulfill it. True power is not always loud. In fact, the most transformative power often operates in complete silence, invisible to casual observation, but undeniable in its effects. It's the power of someone who has learned to change everything around them by changing nothing but themselves. It's the influence that flows from integrity rather than manipulation, from example rather than argument, from being rather than doing. It's the quiet storm that reshapes landscapes not through violent weather, but through persistent presence. The disciplined person becomes this kind of force, not because they seek to influence others, but because their own transformation creates ripples that extend far beyond their immediate environment. Their children learn that commitment is possible by watching someone honor their commitments daily. Their colleagues discover that excellence is achievable by working alongside someone who pursues excellence consistently. Their friends recognize that growth is worth pursuing by witnessing someone choose growth over comfort repeatedly. This influence operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. It's not what the disciplined person says that creates change. It's who they've become that inspires transformation. Their presence gives others permission to take themselves seriously. Their example demonstrates that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary consistency. Their life proves that discipline is not punishment but liberation, not limitation but expansion, not sacrifice but fulfillment. The mechanism of this influence is what psychologists call social modeling, the unconscious tendency to adopt the behaviors, attitudes, and standards of people we respect or spend time with. When you consistently interact with someone who maintains high standards, your own standards tend to rise. When you regularly observe someone making difficult choices with apparent ease, your own capacity for difficult choices expands. When you witness someone finding satisfaction in discipline rather than indulgence, your own relationship to discipline begins to shift. But this modeling only works when the discipline is authentic rather than performed. People can sense the difference between someone who is genuinely committed to their principles and someone who is trying to appear committed to impress others. The quiet storm doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. It doesn't seek recognition. It simply creates results. It doesn't demand attention. It simply deserves respect. The family of a truly disciplined person experiences this influence most directly. Children who grow up watching a parent wake up early, exercise regularly, read consistently, and handle stress with composure learn that these behaviors are normal human responses rather than exceptional achievements. They internalize discipline as a natural part of adult life rather than viewing it as an unusual burden that some people choose to bear. This normalization of excellence is perhaps the greatest gift one generation can give to the next. When discipline is modeled consistently and authentically, it becomes part of the family culture rather than an individual achievement. The children don't have to discover discipline, they inherit it. They don't have to develop it from scratch. They simply have to maintain what they've observed as normal. The ripple effects extend into professional environments as well. Teams that include truly disciplined individuals often experience what researchers call elevation, the uplifting feeling that comes from witnessing moral excellence. This elevation motivates others to improve their own behavior, creating what might be called positive contagion, the spread of constructive behaviors through social systems. The disciplined person doesn't need to lecture about time management. Their colleagues notice that they're never late and never miss deadlines. They don't need to preach about preparation. Their teammates see that they're ready for every meeting and anticipate potential challenges. They don't need to advocate for taking responsibility. Their co-workers observe that they own their mistakes and learn from failures. This modeling is particularly powerful because it's non-threatening. No one feels judged or criticized because no judgment or criticism is being offered. The disciplined person is simply living according to their values without requiring others to adopt those same values. This absence of pressure creates space for others to choose change rather than feeling forced to change. But the influence extends beyond immediate social circles. Communities benefit from the presence of highly disciplined individuals because they tend to contribute more than they consume. They volunteer more consistently, participate more actively, and support others more reliably. They become what social scientists call social capital, the network of relationships and shared values that make communities function effectively. The quiet storm operates on generational time frames as well. The disciplined person's influence on their children creates a legacy that extends to their children's children. Values that are demonstrated consistently in one generation become the foundation for the next generation's character development. Principles that are lived authentically in one family become the inheritance passed to future families. This generational impact reveals why individual discipline is never truly individual. Your choice to wake up early doesn't just affect your day, it affects your children's understanding of what's possible. Your decision to exercise regularly doesn't just improve your health, it improves your family's relationship to physical fitness. Your commitment to lifelong learning doesn't just expand your knowledge, it expands your household's culture of growth. The Stoics understood this interconnectedness through their concept of cosmopolitanism, the recognition that we are all citizens of a larger community and that our individual development serves the collective good. Marcus Aurelius wrote about how personal virtue contributes to the common good, not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to be the kind of person who strengthens rather than weakens the social fabric. This understanding transforms the motivation for discipline from purely personal to genuinely universal. You develop discipline not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of everyone who will be influenced by your example. You pursue excellence not just for your own satisfaction, but for the sake of raising the collective standard of what humans are capable of achieving. But perhaps most profoundly, the quiet storm demonstrates that change doesn't require force or manipulation. It shows that the most lasting transformations occur when people are inspired to change themselves rather than being pressured to change by others. It proves that authentic influence flows from authenticity itself, rather than from techniques or strategies designed to influence others. The disciplined person becomes a force of nature, not by trying to be powerful, but by becoming powerfully committed to their principles. They create change not by pushing against resistance, but by demonstrating an alternative that others find attractive. They influence not by arguing for their way of life, but by living their way of life with such integrity that others want to understand how they've achieved what they've achieved. The quiet storm doesn't seek to change the world, it simply changes itself and allows the world to respond. It doesn't try to fix others. It focuses on becoming the kind of person who naturally inspires others to fix themselves. It doesn't attempt to control outcomes, it concentrates on controlling inputs and trusts that the right outcomes will emerge naturally. This is the ultimate paradox of authentic influence. The people who have the most impact are often the ones who are least concerned with having impact. They're too busy becoming who they're meant to become to worry about whether others notice their becoming. They're too focused on living according to their values to concern themselves with whether others adopt their values. In this focus, they become the eye of the storm, completely calm themselves while creating movement all around them. They become the quiet storm that changes everything by changing nothing but themselves, that influences everyone by trying to influence no one, that transforms the world by transforming only the part of the world they have complete control over, themselves. There is a moment in every profound transformation when struggle ceases and presence begins. It's not that challenges disappear or difficulties end, but that your relationship to challenge and difficulty becomes so fundamentally different that they no longer move you. You become like a mountain, not because you're cold or distant, but because you're so deeply rooted in who you are that external weather cannot disturb your essential nature. This is the final stage of discipline, not the ability to force yourself through difficult situations, but the development of a nature that remains steady regardless of the situation you find yourself in. Not the capacity to overcome obstacles, but the wisdom to see that most obstacles are just experiences to be had rather than problems to be solved. Not the skill of conquering external circumstances, but the realization that external circumstances have no power to diminish the internal strength you've cultivated. The person who has become the mountain has moved beyond discipline as effort and discovered discipline as expression. They no longer wake up early because they force themselves to wake up early. They wake up early because they are someone who wakes up early. They no longer choose difficult challenges because they think they should. They choose difficult challenges because they are someone who embraces challenge. They no longer act according to principle despite their feelings. They act according to principle because their feelings have been educated by years of principled action to align with their values. This transformation is so complete that the old psychological categories no longer apply. The distinction between what you want to do and what you should do collapses because what you should do has become what you want to do. The conflict between short-term pleasure and long-term benefit disappears because you've learned to find immediate satisfaction in actions that create long-term benefit. The struggle between comfort and growth dissolves because you've discovered that growth itself has become your comfort. The mountain is not moved by weather because the mountain understands something about time that weather does not. Weather is temporary. Mountains are relatively permanent. Weather changes constantly. Mountains change slowly. Weather is reactive to atmospheric conditions. Mountains create their own microclimates. The disciplined person has learned to operate on mountain time rather than weather time, to think in decades rather than days, to build character rather than chasing experiences. This temporal perspective creates unshakable equanimity in the face of circumstances that would devastate someone operating on weather time. The stock market crashes, but the mountain remembers that markets have crashed before and recovered. Relationships end, but the mountain understands that relationships have seasons and cycles. Health challenges arise, but the mountain recognizes that the body changes while the person who inhabits the body can remain fundamentally unchanged. The Stoics called this perspective the view from above, the ability to see current circumstances from the vantage point of eternity. Marcus Aurelius regularly practiced imagining his current challenges from the perspective of years, decades, or centuries in the future. This practice didn't minimize the reality of present difficulties, but it put them in context that allowed for wise response rather than reactive panic. But the mountain metaphor goes deeper than temporal perspective. Mountains also understand something about resistance that creates their strength. Every force that acts upon a mountain, wind, rain, ice, snow, makes the mountain stronger by compressing its structure and testing its foundation. Over geological time, mountains are carved by erosion into more beautiful and more stable forms. They don't resist the forces acting upon them. They use those forces to become more authentically themselves. The disciplined person has learned this mountain wisdom, that everything that challenges you also strengthens you if you know how to receive the challenge. Every criticism contains information that can improve your character if you can hear it without defensiveness. Every failure contains lessons that can increase your wisdom if you can learn from it without self-condemnation. Every setback contains opportunities that can expand your capability if you can see them without despair. This doesn't mean that mountains don't feel the weather. They feel every drop of rain, every gust of wind, every degree of temperature change. But they don't let the weather determine their structural integrity. They experience the weather while remaining fundamentally unaltered by it. They are moved by the weather at the surface while remaining unmoved by it at the core. The disciplined person achieves this same relationship with the emotional and circumstantial weather of human existence. They feel everything fully: joy and sorrow, success and failure, praise and criticism. But they don't let any feeling or circumstance determine their fundamental choices about who to be and how to act. They can be deeply sad and still show up for their commitments. They can be genuinely afraid and still move toward their goals. They can be intensely angry and still speak with wisdom and kindness. This capacity for feeling everything while being moved by nothing represents the highest form of emotional intelligence. It's not emotional suppression or spiritual bypassing, but emotional integration. The ability to experience the full spectrum of human feeling while maintaining conscious choice about how to respond to what you feel. The mountain achieves this integration through what might be called geological patience, the willingness to think in timescales that transcend immediate gratification. Mountains are built one particle at a time over millions of years. They understand that true strength comes not from dramatic gestures, but from consistent accumulation of small actions aligned with natural forces. The disciplined person operating from mountain consciousness has learned this same patience. They understand that character is built one choice at a time over decades. They know that mastery comes not from occasional bursts of intense effort, but from consistent application of sustainable practices. They recognize that the life they want is created not through dramatic transformations, but through daily decisions that compound over time. This understanding creates what might be called process addiction, the ability to find satisfaction in the daily practice rather than needing satisfaction from eventual outcomes. The mountain doesn't exist in order to eventually become something else. It exists to be what it is, fully and completely, in each moment. The disciplined person learns this same presence, not working towards some future version of themselves, but expressing the fullest version of themselves available right now. But perhaps most importantly, the mountain serves others through its simple existence. It provides shelter, creates watersheds, offers perspective, inspires awe. It doesn't try to serve. It serves naturally through being what it is. The disciplined person who has become the mountain discovers this same natural service. They don't try to help others. They help others naturally through embodying qualities that others find inspiring, stabilizing, and elevating. The final realization of mountain consciousness is that discipline was never about control. It was about becoming the kind of person who doesn't need to control because they've learned to respond wisely to whatever arises. It was never about forcing outcomes. It was about developing the character that creates good outcomes naturally. It was never about overpowering life. It was about becoming so aligned with the deepest patterns of life that effort becomes expression and struggle becomes strength. When you become the mountain, you discover that everything you thought discipline was taking from you, it was actually giving to you. You thought it was limiting your freedom, but it was creating the only kind of freedom that matters. Freedom from being controlled by circumstances you cannot change. You thought it was preventing you from enjoying life, but it was teaching you to find joy in the process of living, rather than needing joy to be delivered by external events. The scariest level of discipline is not scary because it's hard to develop. It's scary because once you develop it, you realize that most of what you thought was impossible was simply inconvenient. Most of what you thought was beyond your control was simply outside your comfort zone. Most of what you thought required exceptional talent was simply a matter of exceptional consistency. You become terrifying to your old excuses because you've become someone who doesn't need excuses. You become unrecognizable to your former limitations because you've become someone who doesn't recognize limitations that aren't based in reality. You become the mountain, unmoved by external weather while creating the internal conditions that allow everything around you to flourish. In becoming unbreakable, you discover that you were never broken. In becoming undisciplined, you realize that you were never undisciplined. You simply hadn't yet decided who you wanted to be. In becoming the mountain, you understand that the mountain was always there, waiting under the accumulated debris of excuses, fears, and false beliefs about what was possible. The discipline that terrifies the world is simply the decision to stop being terrified by your own potential and start being terrified by the prospect of never discovering what that potential actually is. Become terrifying to your excuses. Become unshakable in your commitment. Become the mountain that you were always meant to be. The storm is over. The mountain remains. In the end, we are not judged by the storms we weathered, but by the strength we built while the storms were raging. We are not measured by the comfort we preserved, but by the character we forged when comfort was not available. We are not remembered for the excuses we made, but for the moments we became inexcusable in our commitment to becoming who we were meant to be. You now know the secret. Discipline is not what you do to yourself, it's what you do for yourself. It's not a limitation imposed upon your nature. It's the full expression of your nature. It's not a sacrifice of who you are. It's the revelation of who you've always been, waiting beneath the surface of who you thought you had to be. The choice is simple, but not easy. Remain who you are, or become who you're capable of being. Continue making excuses, or start making exceptions. Exceptions to the rule that says ordinary people can't achieve extraordinary consistency. Exceptions to the belief that you need to feel ready before you act. Exceptions to the assumption that comfort is more valuable than character. The path is clear. The tools are available. The only question remaining is whether you'll choose to walk it. Become the storm. Become the mountain. Become terrifying to everything that once controlled you. The scariest level of discipline is waiting for you to claim it.